Between 1905 to 1913, just before World War II, there was a new group of New York artists of the Ashkin School who emphasized the seedy aspects of daily urban life. Ashkin School was not a physical school. It was a movement often referred to as Ash Can School. Seedy aspects of daily urban life were often depicted in the poor neighborhoods of New York City. Before 1905, American artists mostly created academic art. The Ashkin School was one of the first waves of American modernism. This painting here is titled Self-Portrait by Romaine Brooks from 1923. Brooks came from a wealthy family in New York. At the age of 7, her mother abandoned her and left her to be raised by the family laundress. It was through this experience that she learned aspects of life that wealthier families would never understand or be able to relate to. Even though she was female, Brooks became an established artist and exhibited in prestigious galleries in Paris. In this self-portrait, we see muted gray in the background, like the works of James Whistler. A white collar and cuffs on her shirt are striking in contrast to her dark coat. Her eyes are cast in shadow, creating a subtle mystery about her. In this painting, Brooks depicts a role usually reserved for men by presenting herself as a flâneur. A flâneur is a French term meaning a person who comfortably strolls leisurely throughout the city. This term was mostly used in context of the upperclassmen of French during the 19th century. Each spring, the National Academy would host an exhibition of the most well-known, academically trained, and traditional artists. In 1907, there were 8 painters whose works were rejected from the exhibition, so they decided to have their own exhibition at the Macbeth Gallery in New York. These artists became known as the 8. The intellectual leader of the 8 was Robert Henri. Robert Henri was a painter who moved to New York from Philadelphia. Henri was a member of the Academy, but soon began to have disagreements about art with his colleagues. 4 of the 8 artists, aside from Henri, were also from Philadelphia. They were John Sloan, Everett Shinn, William Glackens, and George Lux. The 3 other artists of the 8 were Ernst Lawson and Maurice Prendergast, who were landscape painters, and a symbolist painter by the name of Arthur Davies. The exhibition by the 8 was a major event in the history of modern painting in America. These artists showed diversity and different points of views in their work. What united these artists was their dislike for the Academy's strict jury system and their belief that artists should not be told what to paint. Some of the members of the 8 were also part of the Ashkin School. The 2 groups were often referred to interchangeably. Robert Henri created his own art school and became one of the most influential teachers of his time. Henri encouraged his students to reject idealism. He wanted his students to paint from reality, no matter how harsh it may be. Robert Henri is quoted as saying, "Draw your material from the life around you, from all of it. There is beauty in everything. If it looks beautiful to your eyes, you can find it anywhere, everywhere." End quote. This painting by Robert Henri from 1902 depicts a city scene of New York during the winter. What we see here are office buildings and normal brownstone apartments. The street is covered in freshly fallen snow. It is a very calm scene. This was painted in one sitting or a single lesson. There's a quick sketchiness feeling to the painting that shows some yellow mud of the horse cart wheels and the gray slush of the traffic, which makes this painting more real and less ideal. This next painting is by John Sloan, called Hairdresser's Window from 1907. John Sloan was a student of Robert Henri. What we are looking at here is what Sloan had seen on his way to visit Henri at his studio. Sloane loved the scene of people gathered under the hairdresser's window to watch her work, so much that when he went home he painted this from memory. This is not an academic traditional painting. It is an everyday scene of New York in a less well-to-do neighborhood. This next painting is by George Bellows, titled Cliff Dwellers from 1913. Bellows was another one of Henri's students. Here we can see a bold, energetic style of painting. This is what one would normally see if they lived in Manhattan's Lower East Side. It shows the residents forced out onto the streets from the summer heat. Many of the apartments were too hot to hang out in during the day, so many people would venture out to the street and sidewalks or sit on their stoops or steps. Photography was able to capture even more accurately the everyday life struggles of the average and poor person. Jacob Riis was a Danish immigrant who took photographs in alleys and other areas of the Lower East Side. There, he documented the poor conditions and reported them to the Tribune newspaper. In 1890, Riis made a book titled How the Other Half Lives: Studies Among the Tenements of New York. His book became a touchstone for social documentary photography. Here we see one of Riis's social documentary photographs called 5 Cents a Spot, showing the lodging house on Bayard Street. Here we see the poor conditions where several people are forced to sleep in a shared space in a small room. Between 1905 to 1917, the 291 Gallery was a rallying place for modernism in America. The 291 Gallery, also known as the Little Galleries of the Photo Secession, was a place where photographers Alfred Stieglitz and Edward Steichen held photography exhibitions, then later held exhibitions of modern European and African art. The 291 Gallery had close contacts to the avant-garde leaders in Paris, and their mindset was on a broader scale. The New York Dada movement took place at this gallery. The gallery also exhibited works by Matisse, Braque, Cézanne, Toulouse-Lautrec, as well as members of the American avant-garde. Alfred Stieglitz also edited the photographic magazine called Camera Work. This is one of Stieglitz's photographs titled The Steerage from 1907. Here we see a documentation of a crowd of immigrants, but Stieglitz was not only interested in direct documentation, but he was also interested in their juxtaposition of forms and lines and patterns of light and shade. So, for example, we can see, I'll get my highlighter here, we could see the roundness of this gentleman's straw hat. And then if you look straight down, you see this angled bridge going down, and then slightly at a different angle, we have a bar or pole holding that up, and then in an opposite direction, we have stairs going up this way. Alfred Stieglitz considered this to be one of his most successful photographs. Edward Steichen was an aerial photographer during World War I, who later was hand-picked by Rodin to photograph one of his pieces. Here we see Rodin's Balzac sculpture taken at night. It's titled Balzac, the Silhouette, 4 a.m. Steichen, at Rodin's suggestion, took his photos in dim light that required longer exposure. This technique created more volume and a less flattening effect in the image because there was less contrast. A nice example of the use of longer exposure can also be seen in this photograph of Gloria Swanson. Even though there is a pattern across her face from the black lace that is flattening, behind the lace you can see all the soft, subtle variations of grays that give her face realistic volume. Steichen was the chief photographer for Vanity Fair and Vogue magazines, which gave him the freedom to explore portraits with abstract patterns to create compelling images. This next image is a painting by Max Weber, who exhibited at the 291 Gallery. It is called Chinese Restaurant. Weber was more aware than many American artists of the different European art movements. Here you can see his interest and knowledge of Cubism. This is inspired by his experiences of eating in New York's Chinatown. The patterns are representations of the floor tiles, tablecloths, curtains, and other forms that represented all the ideas that were exchanged between Weber and his friends about art during their meals. This next piece is a pastel on paper called Nature Symbolized No. 2 by Arthur Dove. Dove was aware of Kandinsky and shared the same views about non-representational art. This piece is one of the earliest representations of non-objective abstract art by an American artist. This piece is dated from 1911. This piece was done a bit later in 1925. It's not a spiritual piece, but it is an interesting multimedia assemblage titled Gone Fishin'. Dove created a few of these collages, always using the materials that the works were about. For example, he would make landscape collages and use the materials from the land, such as shells, sand, and dirt. Here we see a fishing pole cut into pieces of varying sizes, placed in positions that make an interesting composition. We also see his denim shirt with buttons that he probably wore while fishing. This is a photo taken by Stieglitz titled O'Keeffe, Hands, and Thimble. In 1917, a 291 gallery had its final show, which just happened to be Georgie O'Keeffe's first solo exhibition. Stieglitz and O'Keeffe married in 1924. Stieglitz made over 300 photographs of O'Keeffe, which not only helped his career, but gave O'Keeffe an almost cult status in the art world during this time. Georgie O'Keeffe's work has become icons of American art. This piece is an oil-on canvas from 1919, titled Music, Pink and Blue 2. This abstraction relates to forms in nature. Two things of interest are the relationships between the colors and the relationships of the organic forms. O'Keeffe's abstractions are derived from nature. Many are details of flowers. They can at times be interpreted as having sexual connotations. Some people, usually male art critics and historians, have interpreted her abstractions as female genitalia. Part of this is because she was one of the first and few female artists working abstractly, and also because her work was so organic and used such biomorphic imagery that it could easily be compared to the inside and outside forms or parts of the human body. This next piece by Georgie O'Keeffe is titled Cow's Skull with Calico Roses. Many of the sexual connotations and references about her abstractions O'Keeffe rejected. O'Keeffe started painting with more representational imagery in her works to avoid such comments. Her desert motifs were some of the most popular paintings. This is a beautiful painting of whites on whites. We see this in the flowers, the cow skull, and the white sheets underneath surrounding them. There's a dark strip underneath or behind the image in the middle, but just enough off-center to add visual interest. And if you look right here, you will be able to see small areas of light, soft browns in the center of the skull to help make the painting feel more organic, which contrasts nicely against the precise, crisp style of the painting. Georgie O'Keeffe was part of the first wave of American modern painters whose abstractions are completely American in their approach. Another artist associated with the West is photographer Ansel Adams. This piece is Frozen Lakes and Cliffs, the Sierra Nevada Sequoia National Park in California. Adams was influenced by Alfred Stieglitz, and both shared an admiration for capturing life in its entirety. He was an environmentalist, and many of his photographs are of spectacular landscapes and nature. Ansel Adams' photos had a timeless quality and focused on beauty being first in his work. He was upset at man's progress and had the wisdom to realize that there needs to be a balance between man and nature. Adams' works are often quiet, profound, and contemplative. Now we're going to move past the 291 gallery and talk about the Armory Show. The Armory Show was a large international exhibition held in New York in 1913. The show consisted of both American and European artists. Arthur Davies, who is part of the Eight and well respected by the Academy, was chosen as the chairman of the exhibit. The work chosen focused on 19th and 20th century art. The German Expressionists were not represented, and the Orphic Cubists and the Italian Futurists withdrew from the show. However, there was still a large representation of art by Goya, Delacroix, Courbet, Van Gogh, Gauguin, Cézanne, Manet, the Impressionists, Redon, the Nabi, Seurat and his followers, Matisse and the Fauves, the Cubists with Braque and Picasso, along with many American artists. Sculptors such as Rodin and Brancusi, also with others, were included. The show was originally a huge success with praise from the press. But there were some critics and American artists who were unhappy with the show, especially offended by the works of Matisse and the Cubists. Ironically, Nude Descending the Staircase by Duchamp was hailed with positive review. There were over 75,000 people who attended the Armory Show in New York, and over 200,000 people visited the Chicago Art Institute, who displayed the European section and some of the American work. The Armory Show was an impetus, a large motivation for the advancement of modernism in America. There was a new unorganized movement in America starting around 1918 that was referred to by a few different names. One was the Immaculates, another was Cubo-Realists, and more popularly as Precisionism, otherwise known as the Precisionists. Precisionism is a hard-edged painting style focused on modern subjects. The work is representational, showing geometric simplification. The work is inspired by sharp, focused photography and strips away much of the detail. Their subject matter consisted mostly of still lifes, architecture, and machines. Some of Georgia O'Keeffe's work could be viewed as precisionist, but she's not necessarily part of this group. The main artists associated with forming this style are Charles Sheeler and Charles Demuth. Charles Sheeler was born in Philadelphia. In 1919, he moved to New York, where he already knew Stieglitz and exhibited his work in his salons. In New York, he met Dada artists like Duchamp and Man Ray. Sheeler began photographing skyscrapers while tilting his camera and using high exposure techniques. Sheeler would then translate his photos into paintings. Here is an example of this process, and this painting titled Church Street L from 1920. Sheeler is on a tall building in lower Manhattan looking down. His work is abstracted through his simplification and breaking down into geometric shapes and his use of flat colors. In his later work from 1939 titled Rolling Power, we see quite a change. This piece was also aided with a photograph Sheeler had taken, but shows much more detail. The work here is precise, with an immaculate smooth surface depicting a machine working perfectly. Sheeler's work in the 1930s and 40s celebrated the modern industrial age with machines, power plants, and factories. Charles Demuth was also from Pennsylvania. He enjoyed working in watercolor. In this watercolor titled Rooftops and Trees, we see the shifting in planes implying multiple views. His use of color is minimal but varied and precise, especially in his drips, which you can see more in the center area of the painting. A few years later, Demuth created work such as this one, titled The Figure 5 in Gold, painted in oil. He referred to these works as posters and said they were portraits of artists, reminiscent of some of the Dadaist symbolic portraits. This piece here is attributed to William Carlos Williams, who was a friend and poet. It is based on a poem by Williams about his experience of seeing a large gold number 5 on a roaring red fire engine. The poem reads, "Among the rain, the lights, I saw the figure 5 in gold on a red fire truck, moving, tense, unheeded, to gong clangs, siren howls, and wheels rumbling through the dark city." The 1930s was a very difficult decade, starting with the Wall Street crash of 1929 and ending with the start of World War II in 1939. It became known as the Great Depression. Artwork during this time became more socially conscious. One of the most famous novels of that decade was The Grapes of Wrath from 1939 by John Steinbeck. It dealt with the depression and struggles of victims of the Oklahoma Dust Bowl as they migrated to California. Like the storyline in this novel, artists focused on contemporary American life. The United States government started an initiative called the Federal Art Project that was central to the survival of many artists during the 1930s. The Federal Arts Program was a program that hired American artists to create murals and other art for government-owned buildings. One of the artists that benefited from the Federal Arts Project was Thomas Hart Benton, who created a series of murals about modern technology for the New School of Social Research in New York. This series was called America Today. The mural is titled City Building. Here, construction workers are seen as heroes building New York and making it bigger and better. We can see the New York City skyline in the background. Benton studied the poses and anatomy of Michelangelo and El Greco for his figures. Quite different in his style, both in subject matter and in technique, is Grant Wood. Grant Wood was influenced by 15th century Flemish and German primitives. This painting, titled American Gothic from 1930, is Wood's most famous painting and has become a national icon. The house in the background is from the 19th century Carpenter Gothic house. In this painting, it is seen in the pointed top part of the house, so you can see that right up here, right there. The implied married couple are actually not married. The female is Grant Wood's sister, and the male is a dentist from Iowa. However, it is implied that these two Puritan farmers are a married couple, and it was painted with affection by the artist, even though their mannerisms look overly harsh. This painting has been produced more by other artists and twisted to create all kinds of different statements about society and politics than any other American painting. I could easily spend an entire lecture discussing this painting and comparing it to its recreations by other artists. But for now, let's move on to Edward Hopper. Edward Hopper was a New York artist who dealt with more urban themes. Edward Hopper was a student of Robert Henri. Even though his paintings aren't rendered in a highly realistic manner, Hopper successfully creates light often in the early mornings or late afternoons. Those two times of day can be the most interesting because that is when you get the long shadows. In this painting, titled Early Sunday Morning, Hopper paints a long building on 7th Avenue in New York. We see the harsh morning light casting long shadows on the concrete sidewalk and the face of the building. The lack of humans makes this painting quiet and still. This next painting is similar in many ways. It is titled Carolina Morning from 1955. Here we can see a woman standing outside in a doorway wearing a red dress and hat. She is standing in the light with a strong cast shadow from the overhang above her head. Even though there is a figure here, it is still a scene of solitude and isolation. His work tends to have a kinship with surrealism through his quiet isolations and endless city landscapes. This next artist used for his subjects the African American experience. This piece here is titled The Migration Series, Panel Number 1. During World War I, there was a great migration north by Southern African Americans, by Jacob Lawrence from 1940 to 1941. This was a narrative series where he made 60 panels describing the scenes of their migration north. Lawrence attached his own text to each of the paintings, describing the causes for the migration and how the workers encountered difficulties as they entered the railroad and steel mill cities like Pittsburgh, New York, and Chicago. Lawrence unified his series using common colors like red, green, yellow, and black, and also through his style of using bold and defined silhouettes. This painting is titled The Passion of Sacco and Vanzetti by Ben Shahn, who is considered to be a social realist painter. Ben Shahn put his political views into his work. He created posters, paintings, and murals that spoke against fascism and social injustice. He often portrayed the hardships that the working poor had to endure. This painting here depicts the famous trial of Sacco and Vanzetti. Here we see 2 men in the caskets and 3 men standing over them. The 2 men in the caskets are Sacco and Vanzetti, who were on trial for killing 2 employees of a Boston shoe factory during a robbery. They were convicted and sentenced to death. However, there was speculation that they were innocent and convicted more for their political beliefs. The title, starting with the Passion of, is in reference to Christ's martyrdom. This scene symbolizes to Shahn that the government suppresses political oppositions. Above the caskets we see 4 villains who are distinguished judges and Massachusetts citizens who recently executed Sacco and Vanzetti. And if you look, we see the original painting over here where Sacco and Vanzetti are in the caskets, and these are the men we're talking about up here in the detail over here. Now in the center is A. Lawrence Lowell, the bigoted president of Harvard University, who was appointed by the governor of Massachusetts to be the chairman of the commission to review the Sacco-Vanzetti case. Lowell was an admitted racist who believed in racial quotas, which he established at Harvard. His 2 compatriots were the president of MIT and a retired judge named Grant. Now, framed behind them, almost hovering over them right here, is the judge Webster Thayer, who presided over the trial and made a mockery of justice. He told people he was out to get these radical Italians and he would not rest until they were in their graves. Nobody will ever know whether if either both of these men, Sacco and Vanzetti, were responsible for the killings, because the evidence was either tampered with or destroyed by the state. We are now going to look at a couple photographers. In 1935, the Federal Farm Security Administration, FSA, hired photographers to document the dire conditions caused by the Great Depression. One such photographer was Dorothea Lange, who shared both respect and compassion for her subjects. Here we see a mother with 3 of her children in a migrant workers' camp. This is a largely reproduced image and has been called Madonna of the Depression. It is actually called Migrant Mother from 1936. Dorothea Lange is considered to be the first documentary photographer. Lange considered documentary to be a quality that the artist responds to. Lange often staged her photographs to capture more powerfully the message she wanted to convey. This way she could express her message without having to wait for a chance encounter that may never happen. This next photograph is called The Kiss by Alfred Eisenstedt from 1945. Eisenstedt was one of the first 4 photographers hired by Life magazine. This photo appeared on the cover of the 2nd issue of the Life magazine. This is a photograph of a sailor kissing a nurse in Times Square, New York City on Victory Day. Victory Day was a celebration of the United States' victory over Japan during World War II. There is controversy to whether this kiss was staged, but despite whether it was or not, this photo perfectly captures the joy and relief that many people felt over the event. We are now going to move south to Mexico and look at 2 artists, Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. The artists in Mexico during this time were looking at their own traditions, history, and heritage. Starting in the 1920s, artists in Mexico created murals for schools, menstrual buildings, museums, and churches. They were filled with images of ancient and modern Mexico, and they celebrated new cultural nationalism. The presence of leading Mexican muralists inspired American artists to turn away from European modernism and produce socially conscious art. One such person that inspired American artists was Diego Rivera, who created many murals in his country and in the United States. Rivera spent over a decade in Europe studying and met artists such as Picasso and was influenced by Cubism. He also spent time in Italy, where he was inspired by the Renaissance murals. When Diego Rivera returned to Mexico, he began to receive from the government important commissions for large frescoes. He wanted to create a national style where he could show both the socialist spirit of the Mexican Revolution and Mexico's history. He developed a modern neoclassical style made up of simple forms and large areas of color, which we can easily see here in Flower Day from 1925. This composition is triangular, and we could see that right here. So we could just see a triangle right here. Okay? And that triangular composition is similar to Renaissance or Italian art, thus showing the Italian influence. Rivera also emulates here his Aztec and Mayan influence. This next image is a mural Rivera made in 1932 to 1933 titled Detroit Industry. As you can tell from the title, this is made in the United States in Detroit. Rivera also had large mural commissions in the United States. However, Diego Rivera was a committed communist, and his political views did prevent him from getting many commissions. In fact, one of his murals that he made at Rockefeller Center in New York was destroyed because he put his political views into his work. In this case, it promoted the Soviet leader Lenin. In this particular mural, we see the evolution of technology in a car manufacturing plant. Rivera researched his imagery by touring the Ford Motor plants several times. This mural is referred to as a symphony between man and machine, representing the steel industry. Even though it was made during the Great Depression, there is no representation of unemployment or suffering, nor does it represent the many violent labor strikes that were taking place during this time. Frida Kahlo is an artist who created several self-portraits. As a young girl, she was stricken with polio, and a few years later, she was in a horrible bus accident that crushed her foot, pelvis, and spine, leaving her in severe pain throughout the rest of her life. Kahlo married Diego Rivera. Her work was very separate in style and content from Rivera's, although they were extremely supportive of each other's work. This painting by Frida Kahlo is titled Self-Portrait on the Border Between Mexico and the United States from 1932. Her self-portraits are very intimate and revealing. Here she shows herself in a beautiful long pink dress. On our left, we see artifacts and monuments of Mexico, and on our right, we see the progressive industry of the United States. Kahlo's style of painting is traditional Mexican folk painting. It is like the Mexican votive paintings, where religious figures were depicted surrounded around their attributes or symbols that reflected their characteristics. During our last lecture, we talked about Andre Breton and how he was one of the leaders of the Surrealist group. Breton visited Kahlo in Mexico, and after seeing her work, declared her a Surrealist artist and arranged for her work to be exhibited in New York. Following the success of the New York show, Breton and Duchamp aided in getting her a show in Paris. The physical pains and illnesses she endured and a tumultuous relationship with Diego Rivera provided Kahlo with content and imagery that she poured into her work. This painting, titled Self-Portrait with Thorn Necklace, reflects this. Here we see Frida in an introverted expression as she assumes the role of a martyr. Around her is a necklace of thorns, which is meant to be compared to the thorns around Christ's head. The thorns dig into her skin, which causes her to bleed, representing the pain she feels over the divorce with Diego Rivera. Hanging from the necklace is a dead hummingbird. The hummingbird in Mexican tradition is a symbol meant to bring luck in love. The hummingbird's wings are open to reflect her connecting eyebrows. Above her right shoulder is a black cat wanting to pounce on the hummingbird. The black cat represents bad luck and death. Over her other shoulder is the pet monkey that Diego had given her. It has been said that the monkey represents the devil. Above and around the top of her head are butterflies representing the resurrection. Her paintings are both surreal and autobiographical. Through her self-portraits and creating symbolism, she shows us, the viewer, her life, no matter how beautiful or painful it may be. Now we're going back to the United States. Here we see a painting titled Report from Rockport from 1940 by Stuart Davis. Stuart Davis was one of the few artists working abstractly during this time. Davis was political and committed to socialist reforms, but did not put his political views in his work. Davis liked creating work that had a broad appeal. He studied at Robert Unry's School of Art. This is one of his later paintings that was inspired by the main square of Rockport, Massachusetts. Milton Avery was an artist from Connecticut who moved to New York in 1925. This piece by Avery, called Swimmers and Sunbathers, shows how his work was characteristically created with thin colors that were applied to broad, simplified planes or areas. Avery often painted his family and friends. Here we see them relaxing on a beach. He eventually turned to creating landscapes that became more and more abstracted over time. Avery became a major inspiration in the 1950s and 60s for American field color painters such as Mark Rothko, who stated, "Avery had the inner power which can be achieved only by those gifted with magical means, by those born to sing." Now we're going to talk about sculpture. Up until the 1940s, painting dominated American art. There is much less sculpture being created with much less originality. However, there were a couple European artists that moved to the United States early in their career and continued to sculpt. One such artist is Gaston Lachaise, who was born in Paris. This is a bronze sculpture called Standing Woman from 1912 to 1927. Lachaise focused his career on the female nude. The characteristics that define his sculptures is the stylized way he presented the woman with large breasts and thighs, then delicately created their tapered arms and legs. Here we see an inflated sense of elegance. It can be compared to the primitive sculptures of India and also reminiscent of the many prehistoric female fertility pieces. This next sculpture is a bronze titled Man in the Open Air by Elie Nadelman. Nadelman was trained at the Warsaw Art Academy, then spent time in Paris where he met Picasso and Brancusi. This sculpture represents his style well. The figure is simplified to almost an abstract form. Once he moved to the United States, he was given an exhibition at the 291 Gallery. His style is described as a form of sophisticated primitivism. Nadelman was inspired by and an avid collector of folk art. His work has an amusing wit that commented to his contemporary life. The last artist we are going to look at is Alexander Calder. Calder was born in Philadelphia and became an abstract artist after studying the art of Mondrian. He came from a family of artists, his father and grandfather both sculptors. He studied engineering that would turn out later to help him with his art. He studied painting at New York's Art Students League. Calder's early paintings were scenes from the circus and sports, which were in the style of his mentor John Sloan, who was a student and close friend of Robert Henri. Around 1926, Alexander Calder began to make small, whimsical sculptures made from wood and wire of circus animals and performers. He would then set them into motion. Calder's circus reinvigorated a theme which for modern artists had long signified the marginalized role of the artist in society. In this piece called Romulus and Remus from 1928, we see bent wire that is twisted into a she-wolf and two figures. This is like looking at a three-dimensional drawing. A couple years after this was made in 1930, Calder visited Mondrian's studio, which inspired him to work abstractly. This image is called Lobster Trap and Fish Tail. This is one of Calder's hanging mobiles, which he became well known for. This is a large piece measuring over 8 by 9 feet. This piece is surreal in its title and visual biomorphic imagery, even though it is completely abstract. The red piece at the top can be viewed as a lobster who cautiously swims around as it tries to avoid the wired cage that we see on our right. The smaller black pieces below can be viewed as a school of smaller fish swimming around. Calder's work is both delicate and large. He continued to make his mobiles and began to show his work abroad, which gave him great international success.